Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Insomnia by Kelly Covic. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Silent Sighs. Go to a haunted house, you said. It'll be fun, you said. Despite the circumstances, Rachel smiled, lacing her fingers with Wendy's, and offered a reassuring squeeze. A weird sense of deja vu tickled her memory. There and then gone. It'll be okay. Wendy's chronically cool fingers squeezed back, but didn't release as she once again glanced around, gaze darting everywhere, appearing not to halt on anything in particular. She had her champagne blonde hair in a high ponytail, gray eyeshadow making her blue eyes seem larger. And she had huge eyes, her Wendy, expressive. Moonlight through the glass walls and ceiling of the creepy solarium cast her in ethereal tones reminiscent of a furious fae from long ago lore. Fables told to children to spook them into obedience. She was about the size of a fairy, or so Rachel liked to tease. Wayfish, a good head shorter than her own 5'6", and seemingly fragile. Wendy wasn't easily broken, though. Life had attempted the feat and failed. Rachel would know better than anyone. They'd been best friends since kindergarten. They'd been more than friends for 2 years, a fact that was tugging at her guilt strings. It was Rachel who'd made the first move in the relationship, gotten them kicked out of their prospective families until this dyke phase passed, and landed them in their current mess. Here she thought that would be their worst nightmare. Gauntlet thrown. A coarse grating scratching emerged from the corner to their right on the rotting floorboards, lodging her heart in her throat. Claws on wood. There was no one or nothing present to make the sound. It felt like a warning. A threat. It marked the third time they'd heard it since entering the room over an hour ago. Probably just a rat. I don't think so, Rach. Something's wrong. Trembling, Wendy slid her watery gaze to Rachel's. Storybook images aside, they weren't kids anymore playing in Rachel's pink bedroom with ruffled curtains, disagreeing over music. Nope, they were stuck in a solarium in a 200-year-old Victorian, and all because she'd entered a stupid contest. Honestly, she never thought she'd win. She'd entered the contest 5 years in a row since they'd turned 18. Though Wendy hated scary movies and anything that went bump in the night, Rachel loved it. Well, normally. She'd figured they'd have a fun adventure like the description had said. Get a guided walking tour of the mansion, free range for an hour afterward, and go home. That hadn't happened. A bus had taken the group of 50 winners from the meeting place up the winding, deserted incline road, lined with barren, gnarled trees, through a wrought iron gate to the grounds. A host had done a tour of the 3-story Gothic-inspired Victorian, complete with macabre tales of the house and its history, and the group had splintered to roam about once he'd finished. It was the go home part that went sideways. Still no cell signal. Not for the first time, stirrings of trepidation shifted in her stomach. She could have sworn there were more sets of eyes on them than living present company. Oh, let's try the door again. A nod, and Wendy led her across the darkened room, teeming with cracked, life-size stone statues and shriveled, withered plants in humongous pots. Vines draped from the beamed rafters. It was like a barren wasteland for forgotten nurseries. 3 of the walls and the high vaulted ceiling were glass, opaque from time, dust, and neglect. The 4th wall was brick, faded to a dullish gray, and hugged the house. There was one door from which they'd entered, which had promptly slammed shut after them and locked or stuck. Rachel could still feel the resounding thud as it reverberated in her ears and chest. She'd chalked the occurrence up to a wind or a draft. Delusions, perhaps, but it was keeping her sane. Wendy let go of Rachel's hand and gripped the iron ornate knob of the thick wooden door with both fists. She twisted, tugged, pulled. Nothing. It didn't budge, just as it hadn't before when they'd tried. An exasperated huff, and Wendy threw up her hands. Now what? Rachel shook her head at a loss. Wind or a draft didn't account for this scenario, nor why no one in the tour group had seemed to hear them when they'd pounded or yelled for help earlier. Dread in her gut was morphing into tendrils of fear. She checked her watch, squinting in the dark to read the hands. It's been over an hour since the tour ended. Someone will notice we're missing and come look for us. Wendy glanced heavenward, sighing heavily. I hope so. That was her, ever the optimist, always hopeful. Sunshine in Rachel's otherwise bleak existence. I'm scared, Rach. Crap. Guilt shoved through Rachel's concern. Come here. She pulled Wendy to her, cradling her in her arms, stroking her slender spine, and inhaling the Guess Girl perfume she still insisted on using, even though they were 23, not 17. The familiarity of Wendy's body and her signature scent helped to calm some of Rachel's nerves. I'm scared too. The mansion had been vacant for decades. Built in 1880 by a prominent family, it had stood proudly and quite arrogantly on a lone hill as if it were a castle watching over a kingdom. In the 30s, when all of the original family tree had died, some in the house or moved away, it had been an orphanage, then a convent, then a psychiatric facility, until finally falling into private ownership once more. The last resident had attempted to restore the place to its former glory, but a series of fatal accidents among the crew and rumors of evil spirits had forced him into bankruptcy. The ceiling in the attic sagged. Many of the pretty stained glass windows throughout the second and main floor were broken. Mildew clung to corners. Vines climbed the plaster. Wallpaper peeled. Floorboards buckled. Sheets covering furniture had inches of dust. Graffiti and refuse littered a majority of hallways, bays, and rooms. It was achingly sad. A grand house that would never be a home again, abandoned and unloved, left to its own devices. Speculations of what the mansion did with those devices was what had made it a legend. If one listened to gossip, the house had claimed many victims in its 2 centuries, ate them, consumed and devoured, tortured souls like idle playthings, terrorized visitors by the whim of its moods. So, yes, Rachel was terrified. She hugged Wendy tighter, ducking to press her forehead to hers. Such soft skin, plush mouth, pert little nose when she wrinkled when amused. They'd been through so much together, and Rachel loved her so dang much. From girls as friends to their teenage years, and then adults as lovers. Animosity of the gay community, discovering their preferences, learning how to be themselves. Boys and bullies, and striking out on their own. Wendy was her whole world. Brows furrowed, Wendy eased away, smoothing Rachel's unruly brown strands. Chances were her hair was in chaos, the flat iron style having gone flat hours ago. It never cooperated. Love you, Wendy whispered. Love you more. Frowning, Rachel eyed the spacious room, roughly 100 square feet and rectangular in dimension. Putrid scented soil, statues, dead plants, shadows that created more shadows. Some of them seemed to move by way of a trick of the mind. It was damp and dank. Beyond the panes of glass, black walnut, oak, and maple trees encompassed the isolated estate, branches bare and reaching for an inky sky. I wonder if there's another way out. Besides breaking the glass, which they'd already tried, ad nauseum. Doubt it, I'm too terrified to move. Rachel chewed that over. Will you be okay if I go look? I'll be right back. They had to do something besides stand around waiting to be rescued. Famous last words. Wendy glanced at the door, features tense. Go ahead. I'll stay here in case the door unsticks or someone comes. Good plan. Though the solarium was big, it wasn't vast. Pots and statues had originally been placed to create a winding path throughout, however, blocking the view of every nook and cranny. A brief kiss, and Rachel cupped Wendy's shoulder. I won't be far. Okay, hurry, please. Starting on the wall to the left of the door, Rachel made her way around planters and risers to the glass. She pressed her hand to the cool pane. No latches. The floor-to-ceiling windows were framed and didn't open. They also appeared to be double-paned. That didn't bode well on why they hadn't been able to break free. Once she was at the corner, she pivoted. She couldn't spot Wendy through the dead foliage. Doing all right, honey? A quiet yes drifted across the room. It sounded farther away than it should. Hollow, echoing as if underwater and desiring to drown. Rachel paused, a foreboding sense of dread in her chest and pushing against her skull. Intense pressure. Pounding, pounding until even her brain hurt. Invisible fingers ghosted against her temple to trip it into stuttering rhythm. Cold walked up her spine in a terrifying waltz. Quiet filled the room, became it, ingested, the kind of silence that wailed against her eardrums, forcing the urge to cover her head. And then it was gone. Abruptly, as if the solarium had sighed the moment away. She was just standing in a glass chamber, nothing to see here, nothing that could be done or should. Panting, rattled to her core, she glanced up at decrepit, snaking vines, as at the leaves on the ground undisturbed, at the statues watching her. Branches and stems and tree trunks long deceased. She'd always listened to intuition, stopped when warranted, proceeded when flagged safe. No matter now, she had to check for an alternate exit, had to protect Wendy, had to leave. Hand on the pane, Rachel kept her gaze trained between the floor and the glass wall, searching. Dried leaves, chunks of dirt, shadows, eyes watching from everywhere and nowhere. Urgency tugged at her midsection. That scratching sound came again to her right, not in the vicinity where it had been standing before. Grinding nails against wood. Dragging. Her breath caught and she froze. Had it followed her? Worse, so much worse was she didn't know what it was or what it wanted. Panic strangled her windpipe and she lurched forward, all but running toward the next corner. A goal. One more after that and she could get back to her Wendy. One more corner if Rachel could just get to the one in front of her. Finally, reaching the end, she turned, oxygen in short supply, and scanned the space. Alone. The idea of it hit her square in the breastbone and culminated into irrational thought that she was utterly, despairingly alone. The feeling nurtured until it swamped her, until a silly idea turned into thought and had become knowledge. There was no one. She unhinged her clenched jaw. Where? She cleared her raw throat. Wendy? Palm on the glass pane to ground her, went Rachel's wheezed air through lungs that had shrunk, probably probing, listening. Not a sound answered. Wendy! Not a question this time, a demand. More urgency pummeled her. Had something happened to her Wendy? Maybe the group had returned? But no, she wouldn't leave Rachel here by herself. Alone, 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 alone. Chest tight, skin frigid, she tilted her head and listened. The silence hung and became its own entity. Nothing. Just her own irregular respirations, so thunderous it was a vacuum in her ears. Hand on her forehead, eyes hot, sinuses stinging, she faced the glass. Rolling hills, creepy trees, darkness, isolation. Fog floating, hovering across frost-tinged grass. And her peering out at it all, at the world, looking. Always looking outside, but no one ever saw in. They couldn't seem to spot her. Eyes were the windows to the soul. She'd heard that once from her grandmother, but there were so many eyes here, she didn't know which were hers among the fray. She couldn't see them. She could feel them, though, here in the solarium with her, waiting, watching, unblinking for her to join them. Breathing shallow, she gazed at her moonlit reflection quivering, at her round face and remarkable brown eyes, brunette strands wildly curly and this side of frizzy. Confusion muddled her brain. Thoughts jumbled. She didn't recognize herself, this half-portrait of an image in the glass staring back at her. How had she gotten here? Where was she? Who was she? Just as before, the silent sigh expelled the lucid dream back into an unfit absolute reality, and one not altogether sane. That's right. Wendy was by the door, waiting for her. The tour group would be departing soon. They'd come looking for them. Someone will come. She shook her head, or tried to, but something moved in her peripheral, and she gasped. There. The panel to her right, where the walls met. The corner. She'd been trying to get there and hadn't realized she'd arrived. What was it? Something outside? Help, perhaps? Or worse, something inside with her? Except the something was a nothing. She let out a ragged exhale and pivoted. A face appeared in the glass, hers, yet not. White, transparent, gaunt. Sunken cheeks and holed black eyes. A face without form, and so suddenly her heart stopped. A scream rent the air. Hers? She fell onto the floor with a bone-jarring thud, crab crawling away from the windows and backed solidly into a pot. Branches clawed at her hair, scratched her face. She shoved at them and darted a glance at the window. It was gone. The face had disappeared. She gripped the front of her shirt with both hands, fisting the sweater, chest heaving, heart raucous, pulse jackhammering in her carotid. Wendy, she had to get back to her love. Rachel yelled for her, voice cracking, tears streaming until she couldn't see where she was crawling to through the haze. She swiped at branches, knees protesting the hard floor planks, hands slipping on dried leaves. Wailing, she crawled faster around planters, risers, statues, until she had no clue what direction she'd gone. A sharp, blaring pain smacked her forehead, grinding her progress to a swift halt. Agony radiated from her hairline as she pressed her hand there to stop the pounding. Squinting, she lifted her head. The door. Oh, thank goodness. She'd run into the door where her love would be waiting and where help could find them. They could go home and this nightmare would be over. Wendy? The rasped, broken whisper barely cleared her throat. Wendy? Damn, her head hurt. She tentatively pulled her hand away, finding no blood. There was that. Carefully, she stood on shaking legs, fighting a wave of nausea. No. Wendy wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. Sheer, unadulterated terror clawed through Rachel's ribcage, past tendon and muscle to her heart, shredding the organ. She'd left Wendy right here in this spot just a few minutes ago, right? 5-10 minutes, tops. She said she'd be right back to wait for her. How had Wendy gotten out? Where had she gone? A glance at her watch, and all the blood in Rachel's head shifted south. She teetered. Hours. 3 hours had passed since she'd begun searching for an alternate exit. That wasn't possible, and Wendy would never leave her, not willingly. Panting, frigid, Rachel grabbed the knob in a panic. It wouldn't turn. Desperation clung to every fiber of her being. She was alone. Whirling around, she leaned against the door and slid to the floor. Head in her hands, she rocked. A sob hitched her chest. Warm tears splashed her cheeks. Someone would come. Someone would come. Someone would. Go to a haunted house, you said. It'll be fun, you said. Despite the circumstances, Rachel smiled, lacing her fingers with Wendy's, and offered a reassuring squeeze. A weird sense of deja vu tickled her memory. There and then gone. It'll be okay.